3, there's a very important development in the conversation that's been going on in the Republic. Back in Book 2, in the middle of Book 2, they started to talk about basically what goes into a city, what goes into a society. And so they've been building up their story of that regime, whatever you want to call it. And at 412a, Socrates now says, won't we also always need some such man as overseer in the city, Glaucon, if the regime is going to be saved? So here, Socrates introduces this notion of the overseer, the epistates, president, superintendent, something like that, as the person who's going to fulfill the role of looking out for the good of the city as a whole. And he says a little bit further on, 412c, mustn't the people who are going to carry out this role care for the city? And then at 412d he says, and a man would care most for that which he happened to love. So here he's saying there need to be people who have as their sort of defining thing that they love the city, right? They believe the city is a great thing and they need to care for it. In fact, he says right after that at 412d, wouldn't he surely love something most when he believed that the same things are advantageous to it and to himself? So in other words, these are people whose own conception of themselves is that my well-being can't be separated from the well-being of this thing. This thing is essential to my reality. Right? Well, that's how Socrates himself defined the city. Right? The city was the context that makes it possible for human beings to be human beings. Right? It fulfills the basic human need and provides us with the environment in which we can do our thing. So the overseer is going to be the person, or overseers are going to be people who have that actual view, that correct view about the city, and consequently realize that their own good can't be separated from the good of that. And so their job then is going to be to care for it. And then he says at 414a, isn't it then truly most correct to call these men complete guardians, whereas those whom we were calling guardians up to now we'll call their auxiliaries and helpers? So the point here then is that this is transforming in a way what we have been doing or how we have been thinking about things. So remember, if you go back to that discussion in Book 2, where this discussion about the city began in Book 2, where Socrates was talking with Glaucon at Mantis about how the city comes into being, Socrates was saying the people need to live in a society where they cooperate to make a life in which they can all flourish. But for that to happen, people have to basically divide up the tasks of the city, and each of them, in doing their own thing, will thereby work for the common good. And so he looked at what are the things that need to be fulfilled if you're going to have such a civilization, such a city. And so they had the various sort of productive arts. Got to have farming, got to have people making clothes, that sort of stuff. We also had trade and things like that. But then we got this special role, which was the guardian. So that discussion led us to recognize that there is a unique role, which is protecting the city, taking care of the city, not doing something else, but having the city itself as that which you care about. Now, you remember from back in Book 1, we basically saw that the very nature of a techne, the very nature of a craft, is that you care about a thing and you work on behalf of it. So in Book 2 then, Socrates was identifying that distinctive art, not to be confused with others, of having the city itself as that which you care for, right? Well, that's what's been repeated here. The thing to notice, though, is that in that first discussion, that notion of caring for the city was only understood in the sense of military protection, right? So we thought, who would fulfill that role of caring for the city of such? It would be soldiers, right? Well, here they're saying, no, that's not right. We were wrong when we thought that the role of caring for the city came from the soldier. Rather, the role of caring for the city comes from the overseer. So what are we talking about when we're talking about the overseer? Well, basically, we're talking about the person, not who's just going to fight on behalf of it, but who is looking out for its makeup, looking out for its being well organized and well run, right? And so in place of protection in the sense of military protection, he now uses this language of saving it. So it's worth noticing that language of Sodzen. But then who are these people? Well, when we were talking about the military guardian, we thought, well, we need somebody who can really fight. Here, he says, won't there be need of some such men? Who are those some such men he's talking about? Well, those are the people he was just talking about in his conversation with Glaucon about music and gymnastic, where they were talking about what it takes to have a person really be sharp in their ability to recognize the good functioning of things. And that's basically rooted in the ability to distinguish between what's really beautiful and what's really ugly, right? What truly is something inherently fair, inherently noble, inherently beautiful, showing itself, good form, versus something that's not like that. And then having the courage to stand up on behalf of that thing. Here we're seeing that what the city needs is someone who's really good at recognizing what it takes to be well ordered and well ordered towards the good. And that's the person who's going to have to look out for the city as a whole. So, what this last section of Book 3 really does is it introduces a big transformation in how we've been thinking about the city, because it basically introduces the notion of government. Right? That body, whether it's an individual person or a group of people, that body that runs the city, that is responsible for looking after the running of the city. And it turns out then, as they say here, yeah, you still need to think about the soldiers, but they're not the ones who are fulfilling that proper role of guardian. Their role is to help those who are properly fulfilling the role of looking out for the good of the city. Well, now that's pretty important as a development of and significant improvement over the earlier discussion they had when they were trying to mark out what it really takes for there to be a healthy city. So that's a thing you have to hold on to in its own right. That's the basic idea we're now working with. But now we have to look at how that role, that idea, actually gets taken up in their conversation. So Socrates introduces that role of the overseer, but this discussion also interprets it in a certain way, and it's important to be able to hold on to both the idea of that role in itself and the particular way it's being interpreted, and not just conflate them. So Socrates says, what is it we have to determine? And he said, isn't it who among these men will rule and who be ruled? Now, why would that be the thing you would say? I mean, it makes sense that they're saying we need to figure out who's going to fulfill this role. But should you automatically name that in terms of the ruler and the ruled? I mean, maybe there's a kind of a sort of an innocuous interpretation of that, where ruler is just another word for overseer. That's fine. And so the one who's doing the ruling is doing one thing, and those over whom that ruler is exercising his rule would be the ruled, right? That would be just another way of saying the overseer and the overseen. But there's also a stronger way to interpret ruler and ruled, and that's more or less to say there's sort of a really radical distinction between them, and these ones are the bosses and these ones are the bossed. Right? Another way of putting that is, if we're talking about the role of government, there are many ways to interpret that. And to think that those in government are your rulers isn't always quite right. But so I think that's the thing that's going to happen here is the role of overseer is very quickly going to get interpreted as, or at least not distinguished from, the role of ruler, almost in a sort of king-like sense. And so we need to be careful about that. Right, it's a very different thing to say human communities need government and to say people need to be ruled. So that initial, perhaps innocuous slippage between the terms can easily turn into a not so innocuous thesis about the human condition. Right. Anyway, how do they end up interpreting it through this conversation? Well, they end up really coming up with a pretty rigid thing that says there's going to be this radical kind of, let's say, for lack of a better word, class difference between that whole group that we're going to call the guardians, which will have two parts to it: the complete guardians, who are the rulers, and the other soldierly-like ones, who are going to be the auxiliaries and helpers. Those as the whole are going to be, the really good people who are going to be ruling all those other people who are the craftspeople, people who are surely going to have no part in rule, but for whom, or with respect to whom, it's also going to be essential to mark out a clear distinction. Like, you're on that side of the line, you can't come onto this side of the line. You're not supposed to. And those rulers, in order to maintain that distinction, are going to live on the basis of a belief that everybody's going to hold on to, that they're a different, qualitatively different kind of being. They're going to be the gold people as opposed to those bronze ones who are doing the crafts and so on. And their job is going to be to perpetuate this whole system and all of the structures of nurturing and so on that simultaneously set up that situation and set up in people the understanding that that kind of system is right. And then further, those people themselves, all the people in that guardian class, are going to live quite an austere life. They're going to live in a situation where towards each other they almost act as if there are no real family distinctions. All the men are sort of brothers of each other. They're gonna eat in common, and they're not gonna have private property. They're gonna share things, and later we find in book 4, they're not gonna really distinguish whose wife is whom, or whose child is whom, or whose father is whom. So there's a very particular view of these kinds of people. So I want to think about that picture because rather than exploring it in detail in the text and thinking about it, I want to just note that that thing they're doing is describing the city of Sparta. So, if you're just reading this description of a city as you sit around in the 21st century in, let's say, North America, and you read this stuff, you might think, oh, these are people just making things up, as if they had, their own bright ideas about how a city should be structured or something like that. And that's not what's happening at all. Socrates is talking to Glaucon and Adeimantus, who are aristocratic youths. And they're talking about issues that are much talked about amongst those people. For those people, Athens, where Socrates lived and where this conversation is taking place, was recognized as a bit of a novelty. It was a new kind of city in Greece, characterized by democracy, a form of governance that was, at the time of this conversation, roughly 100 years old. And that's not just 100 years old in Athens, like it's 100 years old in the world. And Athens also, was a place of great, intellectual learning. But, even in contemporary culture, when you think about the university, people don't always think, oh, that's a great place. They also think, oh, those are a bunch of people with their head in the clouds, or those are people who learn how to say lots of smart things, but they don't really know much about the world, and they can make things look true that aren't really true, and things like that. So that is true both of how Athens was perceived and to a significant degree of the reality in Athens. Right there was a, just as is true of the university, there was a big intellectual development that gave rise both to great learning and also to the ability to use one's intelligence, for evil purposes or dishonest purposes. And so Athens was looked upon by many people with a lot of skepticism as a place not of a great advance in civilization, but as a kind of decay. Furthermore, the democracy in Athens meant that all kinds of people, craftspeople, peasants who did crafts, people who just did manual labor for wages, those people were allowed to vote on the city's matters, whereas in other cities that generally was not allowed. So the aristocratic population in Greece tended to look upon Athens as a site of the corruption of what is good. And that's also true of lots of the aristocrats in Athens. So when Socrates is talking to people in the Republic or in almost all the dialogues, he's very commonly talking to people who are aristocrats and who see the sort of rising intellectual culture and the rising sort of popular culture of Athens as something not so great, and they look back to the good old days. And so to the Greeks who had that kind of point of view that I'm talking about, Sparta generally stood out as a place that they thought was specially good. Sparta was kind of revered in popular, aristocratic at least, imagination in Greece, partially because the Spartans were great warriors. They were amazingly strong, amazingly effective in war, and that won them a lot of admiration. But they also were distinctive in other ways. They had a very austere lifestyle, and we use the word Spartan to refer to the lifestyle of someone if they're living in an austere way. They had a very Spartan lifestyle, and they were famous for not talking very much. And so Sparta is the area of Greece where Sparta is from, is called Laconia, and we also call people who don't talk very much laconic, people who, use their words very sparingly. So we've taken over those adjectives, Spartan and laconic, from the reality, or at least the perceived reality, of Sparta in this time. But so I want to tell you a little bit about Sparta and this thing that people admired so much. Sparta was a city in which the only citizens, which means primarily the only people who could make decisions, who could participate in popular assembly to make decisions about the running of the city, were soldiers. Those were also the only people who were legally allowed to own the land. They're, relatively small portion of the population. But that relatively small portion, all soldiers, owned all the land and made all the decisions for the city. From that group of soldiers, a small number, I think 5, were selected as the ephors, and they were the people they made a council that was mostly responsible for making major policy decisions. There was also a council of elders called the Gerousia, who, as far as I know, didn't have any policy-making power, but they were sort of advisors. The city also had 2 other people who are called by the Spartans archagatai. And sometimes you'll see that translated as kings. It's not a very good translation in my mind. I mean, Greek doesn't really have a word for king. There's a number of words: wanax, basileus, archagatai, hegemon, tyrannos. They all mean very specific things, and in different contexts you might see any of them translated as king, but none of them corresponds really to what in English we mean by that. But so sometimes you see these guys in Sparta referred to as kings, but I think that's not really quite right. They held hereditary positions where they were primarily religious figures. They looked after religious services in a religious leadership role in war and in the city. And they came from exactly two families. So there are two really powerful families that lived there, and they each had, their kids coming down in these really powerful religious / political positions. But those are the people who ruled Sparta. There are lots of other people there too. The next most noticeable group would be people that we would normally call slaves. They called them helots, and those were people who had been conquered in war before, in the land that the Spartans now controlled. They conquered it and they enslaved those people. Those people weren't owned by individual Spartans. They were construed as tied to the land they lived on. So if the people who owned the land, effectively owned them, but they couldn't take them elsewhere. They couldn't sell them individually. If they sold the land, those people went with them. And those people, of course, did the bulk of the agricultural work. So the Spartiates, the Spartan soldier citizens, grew very wealthy from owning the land and receiving great bulk of the agricultural produce. And the helots who worked the land would live on the portion of what they produced that they were allowed to have. Also, there was another group of people there called the perioikoi, which means the people who lived around. And those people were the tradesmen, craftspeople. And they worked, but they would get paid for their work. They couldn't own land. Only the Spartiates could own land. And they engaged in trade, basically, then, with the Spartans proper, the ones who ran the city. And presumably they also paid rents for living there. Another thing to know is that the Spartan women functioned as the heads of the households, like they ran the domestic affairs, and they are the ones who would go out, to buy things from the tradespeople and so on. These women also were educated. The Spartans educated their women in math and in reading, and so they had a similar but not identical education to that of the men. Sparta also, so these they were soldiers, and they were famed for being great soldiers. They also had a pretty striking kind of lifestyle. And Xenophon writes about this in his work, The Constitution of the Spartans. They lived, it was like a military camp. They ate together, the people ate together. They had very strict rules for the raising of the youth, especially the boys who were going to go on to be soldiers. They had to go through, it was like boot camp. They had to go out in the winter in the cold with no shoes, and they had to do lots of strict training while not being allowed to eat that much. They were actually encouraged to steal things from the helots and so on, but they also were not supposed to get caught at stealing, so they were supposed to learn how to be stealthy and so on. Lots of things like this, and you can read in Xenophon more of the details about how they were raised and trained. Also, they were taught, the children being raised were taught to think of themselves as basically answerable to any adult male Spartan as if that person were their father. So any adult male could punish a young man who wasn't seen to be doing the right thing as if he were his own son, and so on. So I described that because if you see the reality of the organization of the city-state of Sparta, you can see that it's basically identical to the city that they're describing. I suppose identical is too strong a word. There's a detail here or there that's not the same. But basically, if you look to the way all of the questions that come out get answered in terms of how this should be done, how this should be done, how this should be done, you think the answers are almost all the answers one would give if one were looking at Sparta. Indeed, that's true also of the real stripping down of artistic culture. I mean, I'm not saying that about the details of saying, "Oh, Zeus shouldn't do this," or in the stories or whatever, but just this sort of real lack of appreciation of the weight of art seems right. Sparta did not produce poets, didn't produce artistic works, unlike Athens, which is overwhelming in the artistic creation that came out of it. So there's this isn't people sort of making up in their mind some idea about an ideal city. This is people giving voice to an extremely common popular cultural view, at least among the aristocrats, of what a city should be like. So it's important to know that as you read this, and then to remember also, in the Apology, Socrates, and similarly in the Crito, Socrates basically says he's giving his life for the city. He has stood by Athens his whole life, and now that he's being judged guilty, he's going to go along with that. In other words, just as Socrates told you lots of things in the Apology about his views about justice, it gave you evidence about his views about how to treat the words that are attributed to the gods and so on. He also has made it pretty clear that everything he stands for is embodied in Athens, including his practice, of his activity of going out and questioning people and so on. And at the end of the speech, he says, "I couldn't go anywhere else because they wouldn't allow me to do this." And indeed, in various dialogues, people are saying to him, "Man, you better be careful if you talk like this. If you went to other places, they wouldn't let you say these things." And so Socrates is, in his behavior and in his avowals, is very clear, I think, how much he thinks the central principles of Athens are the ones he stands for. In the Protagoras, for example, Socrates there says, here's how we run our government in Athens, because we have the view that everybody has the capacity to contribute to wise decision making, and he includes him in that account. And so it's not hard to see all kinds of ways in which Socrates is committed to Athens. But Athens, is a very different place from Sparta. As I mentioned, they have a democratic government, and that means the control of the city, the participation in political decision making is not restricted to that small group of elite, wealthy warriors. And they are also not the only ones who can own land. Right? Citizenship extends much more broadly. And the extension of citizenship is commonly associated with the name Solon as the guy who first really made that happen. And then in various ways from the time of Solon up to basically the time of this dialogue, the range of who could participate in decision making, which is to say the range of people who were accorded the status of citizen, grew greater and greater. So not only was it not just the warrior elites, it's also all those peasant tradespeople, and even more than that, people who don't even have trades, people who are just wage laborers. So it's important to see that the structure of governance in Athens is very different from the structure of governance in Sparta, and very different, therefore, from that structure of ruler and ruled that was starting to be articulated in Socrates' conversation with Glaucon. A few other things. In Athens, there were also slaves. Slaves were generally other Greeks who had been captured in war. And what slavery meant was basically that those people hadn't been able to pay the ransom to be able to be free. And so they essentially were working for the people who owned them. if they were skilled people, they would work as tradesmen, perhaps on a farm or any other context, and they would earn from their work. They would keep some of those earnings, and a certain portion of their earnings would go to the Athenian who putatively owned them. If they were unskilled laborers, then they would typically be domestic workers who would work around the house. So I guess I mentioned that for a few reasons, but the most important one is just as the word king is an English word that doesn't easily relate to the Greek context, and if you see someone translate some Greek word as king, you're likely going to bring the wrong associations. In a similar way, you should be careful about thinking about the word slave. We have a lot of associations with the word slave in the contemporary world. And when you see references to slaves in Sparta or slaves in Athens, you have to be careful not just to take your associations with that from some particular, whatever, European context or something like that, and apply it here. Like what you're looking at is very specific social, legal, and political and economic relationships. You need to know what they actually are and think about them on those terms rather than just imposing your assumptions based on your association with some other words. So anyway, so that's a little bit about what slavery meant in Athens, and in talking about the Helots, I was talking a little bit about what slavery meant in Sparta. Also with respect to women, unlike the Spartan women, Athenian women couldn't leave the house. They were secluded, and they, in the house, could only deal really with the men in their family and the very close associates of those men. If they left the house, it could only be to go to the homes of relatives. They didn't go out in public. So unlike the Spartans, the Athenians had the men go out and do whatever had to be done, to buy stuff for the sake of running the household and so on. So that's enough quickly just to give you a picture of these two cities and how they're different, but especially to get you to see the context within which this dialogue is being spoken, the context of Athens, but then also to see what the resonance is of the things that are being said, namely Sparta. Right? So in the context of this conversation in Athens, you're basically getting people saying, oh yeah, this is how they do it this is how they do it in that great place, or this is how it should be done. So then I want to say one more thing. As I said, Athens is a democracy and kind of the exemplary case or the originating case of a democracy. Sparta is basically an oligarchy, right? It's a city run by a small, rich, and powerful group. And indeed, that's sort of the big political debate in ancient Greece of this time is, oligarchy versus democracy. But the other thing I want to add about that is that, the oligarchy is the rule by, privileged elite group, relatively small group. And part of the ideology, I'm not quite sure what the right word is, but part of the mythology, I suppose, of that group is that we're better people than you nasty peasants. We warrior elites are a special type. You peasant tradespeople are something else. And one of the really powerful and pervasive ways that's articulated is the association of the nobility with gold. Gold is kind of the symbol of the purebred aristocracy. So that political distinction that allows this really powerful group, small group of wealthy elites to rule the large group of poor peasant tradespeople and so on, is not exactly premised on, but rhetorically kind of defended by this kind of claim that we're the gold people and you're the crappy people, whatever that might be, bronze people, whatever, bad thing. And so, presumably we would think that class distinction has its roots in history, and the difference in the way those people live and behave has its roots partially in wealth, but related to that in how those people are brought up and all that sort of stuff. So what that story about saying we're the better kind of people, the gold people, does is it basically says we're better by nature. It takes that distinction and says this is a reflection of nature, not something nurtured or cultivated or developed. So I say that because, as I was saying, the whole description of the governing structure that comes out of this conversation is so obviously a reflection of the structure of Sparta. And similarly, this sort of myth about the sort of noble lie about the metals is again very obviously a description of exactly what happens, right? The way the aristocrats claim about themselves, we're the gold people. So I wanted to go through that quickly. It was a very quick sketch, just so that you can have a reasonably realistic vision of the world in which this conversation is taking place, because without that, I think you're really going to misunderstand the thrust of a lot of things that happen here. Anyway, in that context, I want to just draw your attention to one remark here. So basically, the Spartiates think of themselves as the ones who own Sparta. It's their place. They're the ones who make all the decisions. They're the ones who own all the land. It's their place, right? Now, looking at it from the point of view of the categories that have come out in the Conversations Republic, we would refer to them as the guardians. So in Sparta, you have a situation where the guardians basically think the city is theirs. So I just want to alert you to this opening remark by Adeimantus. So book 4 begins again with an interruption. Socrates was talking with Glaucon and Adeimantus interrupted, right? Socrates says, and Adeimantus interrupted and said, what would your apology be, Socrates, if someone were to say that you're hardly making these men happy, and further, that it's their own fault, they to whom the city in truth belongs, but who enjoy nothing good from the city as do others, blah, blah, blah. Adeimantus, looking at this model, says that this is the city of the guardians. Right? He doesn't look at them and think they are of the city. He doesn't think of the city as a thing that is of and for people more broadly, and they're just part of the people who work on its behalf. He's saying these are the people to whom in truth the city belongs. Right? I mean, that's the Spartan view, and I think Adeimantus makes it pretty clear here that that's how he is thinking about things. Talk about one point that Socrates makes in response to that remark by Adeimantus. Adeimantus says, aren't you making the guardians unhappy? And Socrates' basic response is, we're not trying to design something for the happiness of a certain group. We're trying to design a healthy city, which means it's got to be about the goods of everybody. And that's basically just a restatement of the initial principle he named, that people come together out of need for the sake of, mutual benefit. And so he's really saying that's the defining idea of civilization, and so that should be our norm here. That's a powerful and significant point in its own right. But I want to look at a thing he says right after that, right? Because the difference between what he says and what Adeimantus says when he talks about the guardians as those to whom the city in truth belongs really emphasizes what's at stake in whether or not you interpret the overseer as a ruler in the sense I was bringing out before. So the proper role for the guardians, properly speaking, is to be representative of the needs and values of the people who make up that society. Right? The purpose of the society is to basically make everybody happy, so far as that's possible. And so the role of the overseers is to do what can be done to make that happen. Whereas the risk of the guardians from the beginning is that they're not going to care for the people they're supposed to care for. That concern that was brought up in book 2 is really what has come out of Adeimantus's mouth when he said the guardians are the ones to whom the city truly belongs. Right? There you can see a value that says, if you're a member of the guardian class, this city is ours. Right? So Socrates said, remember, that for the proper overseer, this was at 412d, he'd surely love something most when he believes that the same things are advantageous to it and to himself. And so that's, you're supposed to love the city. But notice that those two terms can kind of be switched around, right? It's one thing to think, my nature is to participate in the community, and so it's ultimately to the healthiest thing for me to do to support the health of this city. Right there, you are kind of identifying your good with the good of the city. But you can also have that flipped around and say, when the situation in the city is going to be good? The situation in the city is going to be good when it serves my interests. Right there, you also equated your interest or your good with the city's good, except you've taken the thing you take to be your good to be the primary thing, and now you're kind of holding the city answerable to that rather than the other way around. And that's the risk, it seems to me, of the guardian class in general, right? That they're going to take the city to be theirs and for them, rather than taking themselves to be the city's and to be for the city. So, when a city is well governed, in the sense that Socrates is talking about, that city really is one, because all of those things are cooperating, all the different parts, all the different people playing different roles are cooperating to make their one thing that is their proper shared reality. But when you have the guardians developing the sense that the city is for them and that they are the city, and the other people that they rule are effectively their slaves or their workers or their servants or something like that, well, then the city has become two. It's become this group in opposition to this group. Right? In the first situation, you have a city that's a kind of integrated, almost organic unity, where everybody's doing the thing that fulfills their role in a coherent whole. In the other city, the city where the guardians think they own the city, you have a group of people who are basically using force against another group of people to get something from them. And so that's really a city built on antagonism between two groups. That's not an organic whole. And so that city isn't really one. That's a city, that's two cities at war with each other. But it's also not quite just two cities, because that guardian city can't exist apart from that, producing class of craftspeople and so on upon whom it depends. So it's one city that's defined by a kind of factionalism. And it's one city where there's a rich, powerful class and a poor, weak class, and they're essentially at war with each other. So if you think of the city that Socrates is talking about and the norms that govern it, and what that contrasts to, it seems like what that contrasts to fits pretty close to the city that is being described by Glaucon and Adeimantus, right? It seems very much like the city that's being produced, that leads Adeimantus to think those people own the city, is basically an oligarchy. And an oligarchy isn't even really one city. An oligarchy is really a rich city at war with a poor city, except they're not even really just two, because they can't really be separated. It's a city at war with itself. So I think, that's what Socrates was getting at. He initially said, we're not trying to produce the good just for one group. We're trying to, produce happiness for the whole. And then later on, he says, there's a thing you got to watch out for, and that's the people getting too rich or too poor. And he says, in those cases, it's not really fit to call that a city. This is at 422e. There are two in any case warring with each other, one of the poor, the other of the rich. If you approach them as though they were one, you'll be a complete failure. So I just wanted to bring that out as Socrates' kind of critique of the attitude, it seems to me, that Adeimantus gives voice to, and especially coming to that last line, that if you look at a city of the sort that Adeimantus imagines, you'd really be wrong if you called it a city. That's a city divided. It's a city characterized by faction. So that then would be a bad rule, right? So that conversation, it seems to me, lets us see how the role of overseer and guardian would be mishandled. So I now want to say something about what it seems like it should be. Throughout this conversation, Socrates has really been emphasizing the theme that, if we're going to protect our regime, we have to most be focused on this education and rearing in music and gymnastic. That's what everything hangs on. And that goes back to the very beginning of the discussion with Adeimantus at the end of Book 2, where they were saying, look, this is where people are formed, right? So I wanted just to think about that notion of the protecting the education and music. Right? Really, what that's saying is that it's the musical culture, the culture of music and dance, the culture of poetry, that is the real guardian, so to speak, of the culture. And so what the guardians, which is to say the people in that role, really have to be doing is allowing that music to do its guarding, to do its work. So that's why he says, 424c, it's surely here in music that the guardians must build the guardhouse. My point in quoting that is really just to emphasize the sort of non-separability of function of the music and the people who are the guardians. Now, I want to just bring out a couple of other remarks. Way back in Book 2 at 372d, when he first was describing the emergence of the city on his own terms as something that comes together out of human need and so on, he started by saying, well, you're going to get these few people together. That's going to be the minimum thing you'd need for a city. But then he said, well, but you're going to have to engage in trade and so on. And so the very way he described that city from the beginning was as something dynamic, right? That is to say, even though he had articulated the principle, and you could have a city, the minimal version of it, that very thing is going to have reason to change. Right? Now, he gets to the end of that, and he says, well, have we completed this? And that's when Glaucon gets in the way and says, or interrupts and says, we got to talk about the city nowadays. But at the very end of that, right before they start talking about Glaucon's thing at Book 2, 372d, he says, about these people, like they will hand down similar lives to their offspring, right? So he's saying, in the society we've been describing, people are going to live a certain way, and that culture is then going to get handed down. So from that story in Book 2, from that analysis in Book 2, I want you to hold on to these three notions, right? That Socrates' story is about developing a sense of what human community is from its first principles, and that's the need we have for one another and so on. That doesn't give you a picture of a simple fixed thing. It gives you a picture of something dynamic, right? Because in his very account, you see it go through developments. And part of what that society is a matter of handing down to the next generation what you were before, right? And so for almost everybody, they weren't there at the beginning, right? We're receiving something, we're inheriting something. So I want to now read you another remark from here in Book 4, where he says, this is at 424a, and hence I said, the regime, once well started, will roll on like a circle in its growth. For sound rearing and education, when they are preserved, produce good natures. But this should sound like that thing he said in Book 2 about handing something down, right? And sound natures, in their turn, receiving such an education, grow up still better than those before them. So that remark says this thing in being handed down, and in that sense, in continuing itself, in that sense, in staying the same, is actually going to change. Because it will get better. So my point in drawing out that remark in particular is to remember that earlier society we saw was already dynamic. And here, that point is being made, that just in being itself, it's going to change and it's actually going to get better. So this is very interesting in the context of a conversation where they are regularly speaking against innovation and novelty. Now, how might we hold together that with this notion of something that gets better and changes? Doesn't that produce novelty? Well, maybe yes and maybe no. All of these words, slave, king, ruler, overseer, you got to be careful how you use them, because they're words that can have different meanings. And so you've got to be thinking, well, in what sense is this true? Or in what sense is this not true? So I want to encourage you to think that way about this notion of innovation. Remember, again, back at the end of Book 2, when he was first talking with Adeimantus, he said, should we let the youth be told just any tale made up by just anyone? Right? And I complained there that even though Adeimantus says, no, we shouldn't let that happen, that's what he then goes on to do. He, based on his own idiosyncratic views, is saying, here's what people should study, here's what people should study. So Adeimantus is designing a city where people do get just whatever's made by just anyone, namely by Adeimantus. I'd like to suggest something like that as a model for how to think about innovation in these contexts. Innovation, in the case of Adeimantus specifying how we're going to do things differently, amounts to someone just coming up with something and sort of artificially inventing something new that's forced into the situation. Whereas, when things get better over time, or when a thing dynamically develops into something else, that's not an alien, extraneous force artificially putting something in there. It's a kind of natural growth from out of the same. So on its own, the thing is changing. So something new is coming into being, but that new is the continued existence of the old. It's the new cloak, essentially, for the same reality. So there's a very, very big difference in that case, it seems to me, between something that emerges spontaneously out of something's own natural dynamism and something that is artificially imposed by force from an external source. So I'd like to think about that now with respect to music and culture. So let me read you that one line from Socrates that comes in between a couple of these ones I just read. He says at 424c, "For never are the ways of music moved without the greatest political laws being moved, as Damon said, and I am persuaded." Socrates here is saying the real guardian of the culture is its musical inheritance, its musical culture, its poetic culture. And the thing we have to guard against is innovation, is just anyone by force coming in and saying, we got to do this new thing. So it seems to me that the things Socrates is saying here really amount to a critique of the thing that Adeimantus has been doing since the end of Book 2, right? And Socrates is saying, on the contrary, It's our musical and poetic culture that is what lies behind sort of the constitution of our society. And that is what needs to be protected against the innovation that comes from people like you, Adamantus, using force extraneously to try to shape these things. So, whereas from Adamantus, you kind of get the model of the primacy of him, or the person who he thinks of as the guardian, specifying laws about how to behave, which will in turn specify what kind of music is going to be allowed and so on. I think from Socrates, you're getting quite the opposite. You're getting the idea that it's the musical culture that sort of grounds the organization and the unity of the society. And it's from that that the Constitution is kind of developed. The Constitution is kind of developed. And it's on the basis of that that whatever laws there are going to be would be made. So for Socrates, it seems to me, you go from music sort of through social constitution and law to the minds of individuals, the views of individuals. Whereas with Adamantus, he's trying to go the other way. He's trying to start with the views of individuals through laws and constitutions to music. And if I'm right about that, that is actually also the same as the difference between how Socrates introduced the whole study of society and the way Glaucon introduced it. Remember, Glaucon said there are all these individuals who have certain wants and desires, and they come together and invent society and invent laws to protect themselves against each other and so on. And it's artificial as opposed to natural. Whereas Socrates' account, on the contrary, was the city is natural, and it's individuals that come out of social relations, not the other way around. So it seems to me that between the beginning of Socrates' account in the middle of Book 2 and the end of the account of, putting together the picture of the city that comes up, a third of the way into Book 4, it seems to me that throughout that, you are seeing Socrates defending this account of something like natural emergence, and using that as his route into understanding all these things, in contrast to a kind of individualism that Glaucon and Adamantus bring to this. And Socrates, going back to the theme of inheritance and earning, seems to me Socrates is really, throughout all of this, showing or trying to show that individuals depend for their existence on certain kinds of things they've inherited. Whereas Glaucon and Adamantus take the individual and the individual's views as if they could be had without reference to that which gave rise to them and so on.